Jazeera, Israeli airstrikes kill 4 Palestinians in occupied West Bank's Jenin. 2 Israeli air attacks hit the Jenin refugee camp, while clashes with the IDF forces kill 4 Palestinians near Tubas.
At least 4 people have been killed in 2 Israeli airstrikes on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank, according to Al Jazeera reporters and the Palestinian Health Ministry. Reporting from Jenin, Al Jazeera's Nida Ibrahim said Tuesday morning strikes came after Israeli forces raided the area on Monday afternoon, targeting a money exchange shop and claiming it was linked to financing the Hamas movement that governs Gaza. Ibrahim reported that 4 Palestinians were killed in Aqaba near Tubas, where an Israeli raid prompted an armed confrontation. According to local sources, the Palestinians discovered an undercover Israeli unit that was surrounding one of the homes, leading to armed confrontations. Then Israeli forces used force against Palestinians, some of them doing nothing, not participating, she said. Al Jazeera spoke to Mahadan Abu Sahil, a witness to one of the Israeli air attacks in Jenin, who said Israeli bulldozers showed up in the area as warplanes appeared overhead. Within 5 minutes, he said, the Israeli aircraft struck a building in the neighborhood. After the strike, community members located the remains of 4 people killed in the attack. They are gangs, he said, referring to the Israeli military. Fatah, the Palestinian movement that leads the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, condemned the Israeli attacks, saying the bloody Israeli assassination policy would not stop the Palestinian people from defending their national rights. It said in a statement that the attacks on Jenin and Tubas confirms beyond any doubt that the extremist occupation government seeks systematic escalation with official American approval, support, and bias to implement its plans aimed at liquidating the rights of our people and displacing them. Fatah called on the international community to play its role in immediately stopping the war of extermination against the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Prisoner Society and Israeli forces rounded up 16 people in the West Bank in the past day. That brings the total number of Israeli arrests in the West Bank since October 7th to nearly 10,000. This is from the Times of Israel. Don't push it. U.S. and allies are urging Israel to limit response to expected Iran attack. U.S. officials tell Biden timing, nature of assault on Israel unknown, Washington reportedly shifting aircraft carriers toward Israel, Iran said to have repositioned missile launchers.
Officials in the U.S.-led multinational coalition that is reportedly preparing to assist in repelling an expected Iranian attack have preemptively warned Israel not to respond too strongly to such an assault, according to Tuesday's report. Don't push it, the unnamed officials told Jerusalem. Think carefully before you attack in return. The goal at the end of the day is not to lead to an all-out war. Except that is his goal. In April, a massive drone and missile attack from Iran was foiled. More like it was intended to fail, but okay. Iran said Monday Israel must be punished for Hamas's terror group leader Ismail Haniyeh's assassination in Tehran, allegedly by Israel, and has vowed to take action, raising worries that its response could bring the rest of Middle East closer to all-out war. Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah has also threatened to hit Israel from Lebanon following the assassination of its military leader Faraj Shakur in a Beirut strike last week. Reports have indicated that the reprisals could be imminent. The Wall Street Journal, citing unnamed U.S. officials, reported that Iran has, in recent days, been moving missile launchers and carrying out military exercises, in a signal that it may be preparing to carry out an attack in the coming days. However, U.S. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were told by the National Security Team on Monday that it was still unclear when Iran and Hezbollah were likely to launch their attacks, according to a U.S. official. Biden and Harris were also told that there is little information available regarding the specifics of such an attack, the official said. At the conclusion of a national security meeting on Monday, the White House said Biden and Harris were briefed on U.S. military efforts to support the defense of Israel should it be attacked again by Iran. They also discussed efforts to de-escalate tensions, particularly through the ceasefire hostage release deal currently on the table between Israel and Hamas, the White House said. The U.S. which does not have diplomatic ties with Iran, was also urging other countries to pass Iran a message from Washington advising against escalation, the State Department said.
Hold on. They're like passing notes, guys.
Yeah. Like we're in school.
Yeah. It's like,
Hey, that's not for you, Switzerland. Send it back to Iran.
nah.
Iran, for its part, insisted Monday that it's not looking to escalate regional tensions, but believes it needs to punish Israel to prevent further instability.
It's been a bad boy. Israel's been a bad boy.
I think Israel just really secretly does want to be spanked. I think that's what it is.
I think they need to be punished.
Iran seeks to establish stability in the region, but this will only come with punishing the aggressor and creating deterrence against the adventurism of the Zionist regime. Foreign Ministry spokesman Nazar Kanani said, adding that action from Tehran was inevitable. Well, yeah.
You get hit. Talk shit, get hit is one thing, but you're hitting and expecting not to get hit? I don't.
That's what Daddy USA is for. This is from The Guardian. Torture, abuse, and humiliation. Palestinians on Israeli prison hell. Ex-prisoners report sexual assault and starvation in alleged torture camp presided over by Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Ashraf al-Mutasib is a musician who described leaving Israel's jails with no hearing in his left ear, 4 fractured ribs, and a broken hand, so ill and weak from hunger he could no longer walk. Dropped at an Israeli checkpoint on his own, he says he began crawling towards his home in the occupied West Bank town of Hebron until a passerby picked him up. Mutasib's wife fainted when she saw him, and his son asked, "Who are you and where is my dad?" Picked up on October 8th, 2023, he was not charged before his release on the 7th of April this year. In those 6 months, the 53-year-old said he passed through 3 Israeli prisons, enduring a marathon of torture, abuse, and humiliation, detailed in an interview backed up by medical records and photos that show the impact of multiple beatings and losing 66 pounds of body weight. He said his hearing was destroyed during an attack in his cell in Ketziat prison in November. "I was beaten and kicked in my back, my chest, and my head. I had one side of my head against the wall and was getting blows on the other," he told The Guardian. "The next day, I couldn't hear." The abuse, starvation, and humiliation, he said, endured was part of a pattern described repeatedly in 8 other interviews carried out by The Guardian, and dozens more done by the human rights group B'Tselem. They described abuse so widespread and systemic that it must not be considered state policy, said the group's executive director, Yuli Novak. Israeli jails have become torture camps in which at least 60 Palestinian prisoners have died in detention since the October 7, 2023. Prisoners said they were subjected to regular severe arbitrary violence, including sexual assault. None of the prisoners interviewed by The Guardian left detention without experiencing or witnessing some form of attack. Other abuse and humiliation was constant, from starvation rations to denial of access to basic hygiene supplies, including sanitary pads for women, soap, towels, clothes, and clean water for drinking and showers. B'Tselem's description of systemic abuse echo those raised in private by an unlikely ally, the Domestic Intelligence Service. In June, the Shin Bet head, Ronen Bar, warned prison officials of a crisis that threatened national security. In a leaked letter, he says Israel is vulnerable in international courts to well-founded claims of committing the war crime of inhumane treatment and violating the Convention Against Torture. The Israel Prison Service said it operated according to law and under democratic scrutiny. "We are not aware of the claims you described, and as far as we know, no such events have occurred under IPS responsibility," is said in the statement. That is just fucking ridiculous.
Can you guys ever say anything else?
The Israeli military said it rejects outright allegations concerning systemic abuse of detainees and that it acted in accordance with Israeli law and international law. Abuse of detainees during detention or interrogation were strictly prohibited and allegations were thoroughly examined, a statement said. Fucking bullshit.
It's the same word vomit.
No group of Palestinians appear to be exempt. Women and Palestinian citizens of Israel have been caught up in the dragnet of abuse. Miriam Salhab, a 23-year-old student from Hebron, said she still had back problems from the hours she said she spent face down in the mud after her arrest on the 26th of October, with her hands and legs cuffed, kicked, and attacked for hours by Israeli soldiers. At one point, she said 2 of them stood on her back. "I was suffocated. I couldn't breathe. I saw death in both their eyes, she said. Estimating that the men stayed there, weighed down by all their gear, for about 2 or 3 minutes, they chatted to each other as if nothing was happening, as if they were standing on solid ground. Fascists. Nazis. She said,
Nazis.
she said, damn. She said she was then moved to a cell smeared with the vomit of a previous inmate who had had an infectious disease. Water in the taps had been turned off, so the woman could not even try to clean it. A 48-year-old writer who joined her there got her period soon after her arrest. Refused the pad, she bled through her clothes. Both women said they were threatened with rape and verbally abused. Neither faced charges or trial before their release 5 weeks later, several kilos lighter, as part of a deal to free hostages in Gaza. The far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has presided with vocal pride over the grim transformation of Israel's prison system. In Ketziat, they say, "I am crazy, and I am proud of that. I am proud that we have changed all of the conditions," he said recently to the Knesset. Ben-Gvir also confirmed in a recent letter to the Supreme Court that food deprivation was ordered from the top. There is no starvation, but my policy does call for reduced conditions, including food and calories. He appeared to be so closely linked to the abuse that far-right social networks share pictures of emaciated detainees with captions joking about Ben-Gvir's weight loss plan. A 58-year-old painter, decorator, and father of 4 said he heard guards beat a 38-year-old to death in a neighboring cell at Ketziat in November. One guard told 50-year-old Firas Hassan from Bethlehem, "We are live streaming this for Ben-Gvir." What a fucking monster. Ben-Gvir's spokesperson said the minister was proud of his prison policy and that it was in line with international law. The conditions of the terrorists imprisoned in Israeli prisons have been tightened to the minimum required by law, and in accordance with the minister's policy, the terrorists do not receive the improved conditions they received in the past, he said. What guards wanted the security chief to see, they tried to hide from the rest of the world. Ahmed Khalifa, 42, a human rights lawyer from northern Israel, detained at an anti-war protest, told the court hearing about violence he witnessed in jail. On his way back to his cell, he was beaten and threatened. They told me if I spoke about abuse again, they would kill me, said Khalifa, who was still under house arrest. He described pools of blood on the floor and watching jailers jump on the back of legs of an 80-year-old man. He just cried, Khalifa said. We ended up taking care of the tortured people even though they had no medicine. For some prisoners, denial of medical care was in effect a death sentence. A 54-year-old shared a cell with Muhammad al-Sabar, a 21-year-old with special needs and Hirschsprung's disease. Sabar required a special diet and medication to prevent blockages in his intestine, but when the war started, those provisions stopped. His abdomen began swelling dangerously, and they said they begged a nurse, "He is going to die, please help." The nurse replied, "Go bang your head against the wall." He said he also briefly shared a dirty, overcrowded cell with a paraplegic prisoner, Khalid Shamish, who had developed an infected pressure sore. "I saw maggots coming out of his back," a warder told The Guardian. A month later, Shamish had died. Jailers hung a sign with the "Welcome to Hell" written in Arabic and Hebrew outside one wing. Another comparison occurred to Sari Hari when he was ordered to strip by prison guards as he entered the jail. "They made me get completely naked, and that's when I realized I was entering Abu Ghraib," he said, referring to the U.S. jail in Iraq that became a byword for abuse 2 decades ago. He is an Israeli citizen from Haifa and a property lawyer, and was arrested over Facebook posts about the war. He believes to set an example. "I ticked all the boxes. Middle class, Christian, political," he said. "Everyone told me they stopped posting on Facebook after that. That was the point." He spent 10 days in prison, enough to hear Abdul Rahman al-Mari die in agony in the neighboring cell after a beating. "I feel so guilty that I couldn't help him," he said, breaking into tears. Mari didn't stop screaming the whole time. He kept saying, "I'm dying and I need a doctor." Then he went quiet. In the morning, the guards went in and kicked him. "Wake up, get up." After an hour, they brought the medic and they put him in a bag like trash and took him away. Emancipate the prisoners. We should go emancipate the
You need
prisoners.
to embed the prisons.
This is from The Independent. Hezbollah launches drone swarm after Biden briefed about retaliation from Tehran. U.S. calls for all sides to refrain from escalation in order to secure ceasefire in Gaza.
As the Middle East anxiously awaits an imminent Iranian retaliation against Israel, Lebanese militant Hezbollah claimed to launch a fresh swarm of attack drones and missile strikes at Israeli military targets. U.S. President Joe Biden held round-the-clock crisis talks on Monday amid fears of the imminent retaliation from Iran that could bring the Middle East to the brink of an all-out regional war. Following the suspected Israeli attack that killed the Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Tehran has warned that retaliation is inevitable and that punishing the aggressor is the only way to establish stability in the region. Iran's foreign ministry yesterday called on the U.S. to stop supporting Israel. And despite Hezbollah launching a fresh wave of attacks on Tuesday, the Iran-backed militant group claimed to Reuters that its own response to the Israeli assassination of Hamas commander Fuad Shukr in Beirut last week has not yet come. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are backed by Iran in what it calls an axis of resistance. Israeli warplanes broke the sound barrier 3 times over Beirut in less than 30 minutes on Tuesday, leading to loud booms that sent residents in the Lebanese capital running for cover just ahead of a speech by the head of Hezbollah. A Reuters journalist reported seeing people at a cafe in Beirut's Badaro district scatter as the sound reverberated through the city. Israel is sending bombing runs to Beirut, while Hezbollah is sending drones into northern Israel. Israel bad?
Dead bad. War bad.
Peace good.
This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. How a crackdown on opioids is leaving patients in agonizing pain. People with chronic pain say it's increasingly difficult to get prescription opiates.
Words bubble out of Lori Long, evincing her natural exuberance, but the 51-year-old has been put to the test by debilitating pain. An autoimmune disease inflames her joints and ligaments, forcing her body to curve forward. Since age 15, she's had about 20 major surgeries on her spine and other affected organs. The inflammation and after effects of surgery leave her in constant pain, which she has managed with prescription opioids. For me, pain medication was really life-saving, she said. It allowed me to function and to do more things I would not be able to do without it. Everyday things, like taking a bath, doing my hair, putting on some makeup. She uses the past tense when she talks about her pain meds now. Although she still has a prescription, after several periods of months and even years when she lost access altogether, Long said the doses she is now allowed are much lower than she needs. I've regained some of my function, but I still can't participate in life the way I did when I had better pain relief, she said. People have sought relief from pain for millennia, trying solutions from gnawing on willow bark to smoking poppy seeds. Opioids, which were first derived from poppies by ancient civilizations and now can be made synthetically, are among the most potent pain reliever. But they are also highly addictive. Their use and abuse spun out of control in the late 1990s and early 2000s as pharmaceutical companies aggressively promoted them and doctors increasingly prescribed them. That ignited a crisis of addiction and overdose deaths. In recent years, the U.S. has cracked down on all opioid prescriptions, seeking to stem the crisis. The result, according to many patients, physicians, and advocates, is that the doctors are afraid to prescribe and pharmacists are reluctant to dispense opioids while supplies are limited. Countless vulnerable patients denied medication they say is vital to their well-being have endured needless suffering and even death. And one telling aspect of the situation, Kaiser Permanente, the giant health maintenance organization, is sending letters to its patients on opioids, warning that their treatments will come under scrutiny. It's very clear that some of the unintended consequences of those proscriptive opioid policies ended up harming patients who are taking opioids appropriately for legitimate circumstances and were experiencing reductions in pain and improvements in life and physical functioning, said Dr. Sean Mackey, chief of the Division of Pain Medicine at Stanford. At least 50 million Americans live with chronic pain, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, while millions more have temporary pain after surgeries or accidents. About 5 million to 8 million rely on opioid medications to deal with the pain. But after years in which doctors overprescribed opioids and some patients ended up hooked on painkillers, The U.S. has drastically limited prescription opioids in several ways. The CDC issued new opioid guidelines in 2016 that capped the amounts doctors could prescribe. State legislators and state medical boards passed their own laws and regulations enshrining the CDC's lower limits. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which oversees the manufacture of controlled substances, lowered quotas for annual production of opioids. Since 2013, it has reduced the supply of oxycodone by 65% and that of hydrocodone by 73%. Jesus fucking Christ, dude.
Yep.
The DEA and other law enforcement agencies raided doctors who wrote too many prescriptions above the CDC threshold. Some doctors were hit with fines, license revocation, seizure of assets, and prison sentences. Meanwhile, their patients were cut off from their medications. Federal, state, and local governments sued pharmaceutical companies and drugstores, including Walmart, Rite Aid, Walgreens, and CVS. Most cases have been settled, often for billions of dollars, along with agreements to further rein in opioid production and add extra scrutiny to prescriptions. And they start by not having enough people to fucking work there. But the impact on the opioid crisis seems negligible. While annual opioid prescriptions nationwide fell 44% from 2012 to 2020, according to CDC data, drug overdoses from prescription opioids barely budged, going from 17,029 in 2017 to 16,706 in 2021, according to National Institutes on Drug Abuse Analysis of CDC data. Meanwhile, drug overdoses from the synthetic opioid fentanyl soared from 28,466 in 2017 to 70,601 in 2021, according to the same data. Illegal street fentanyl, increasingly potent and lethal, is the main culprit. The policy assumption was that if you cut access to medical supply of prescription opioids, overdoses would go down, said Kate Nicholson, executive director of the National Pain Advocacy Center, which advocates for the rights of people living in pain. Actually, they've doubled because the response of the market has been to go to illicit fentanyl, which is more dangerous. Sacramento physician Dr. Lee Snook has been practicing pain management medicine since 1987. He entered the field by accident, starting as a hospital anesthesiologist. Sometimes oncologists would refer end-of-life cancer patients with intractable pain for him to treat with anesthesia techniques like epidural catheter injecting morphine. We would do things to help manage their pain, and lo and behold, a number of them were suddenly living 2 or 3 years. That's where I learned that pain kills. Inadequate pain management kills. Alleviating pain is a basic question of humanity, he said. If you can't help patients who need medication management for pain, you're driving them to the street to seek illegal drugs or reducing their quality of life and shortening their duration of life. Treating his patients is a lot harder in the new climate. Due to the restrictions, he has had to taper or reduce doses for patients who had long-term stability. Some have endured adverse consequences, such as serious withdrawal symptoms and even suicide. We're dealing with patients who oftentimes don't have any other recourse, he said. If we have medications we can provide to help relieve the effects of their injuries or chronic pain, we should be able to do that and not fear prosecution. Many doctors are so fearful of a crackdown by authorities that they turn away patients who are taking prescribed opioids for intractable pain. Lori Long, the woman living with chronic pain, lost medication support and continuity of care for almost 2 years after her doctor died. As she sought a new physician, I was treated like a leper from biblical times, she said. No one wanted to touch me, treat me, or give me care. I had doctors tell me, if you only had a cancer diagnosis, I could help you. At 2 separate times, she found a new doctor, but both soon decided that they could no longer practice pain medicine under the onerous restrictions. Eventually, she did find a physician to help manage her pain, albeit at much lower doses than she had before. In a 2019 study published in the journal Pain, researchers from the University of Michigan contacted 452 primary care clinics in 9 states, posing as patients taking opioids for chronic pain whose previous doctors had either retired or stopped prescribing opioids. Only 32% of the clinics said they might accept the patients and continue prescribing their painkillers, while 43% said they would not. The clinics were more likely to accept patients whose doctors had retired. These findings suggest that primary care access is limited for patients taking opioids for chronic pain, the researchers wrote. Bev Schechtman, vice president of the Doctor Patient Forum, an advocacy group, put it more bluntly. They're like medical orphans, she said, of patients whose doctors can't or won't prescribe for them any longer. There's nowhere for them to go. Barriers exist for people who need opioids for short-term use after surgeries or trauma, as well as for those with long-term pain. At 77, Patricia McCormick of Oakland, a retired school psychologist, has had plenty of surgeries, including knee and shoulder replacements. She experienced a huge difference in the pain meds she's been offered post-surgery in recent years compared to the past. In 2015, after battling pancreatic cancer, she had a Whipple surgery to remove part of the pancreas, small intestines, gallbladder, and bile duct, and then rearrange the remaining organs. It is notorious for being an extremely painful procedure. When I went home, they didn't give me enough medication, and I was in agony, she said. I'm old, for God's sake, she said. Give old people a break. Just give us pain medication. Monitor it. Fine, I'm not an addict. You shouldn't have to be in pain in this day and age. As physicians and patients have pushed back, the pendulum is starting to swing from overly harsh rules, but it hasn't yet resulted in a more welcoming climate. Among the changes, a unanimous Supreme Court decision in June changed the legal landscape, saying that higher rates of opioid prescription are not a crime if good faith was intended. The court said prosecutors must prove that a doctor intentionally prescribed the drugs without believing they were medically necessary. Pain advocates hope the decision will embolden doctors to prescribe as they see medically necessary without fear of being prosecuted as drug dealers. The California Medical Board is working to rewrite its opioid prescribing guidelines this year. Medicare and Medicaid in January implemented new billing codes for chronic pain that will allow doctors to spend more time with patients devising treatment plans. The CDC revised its opioid prescribing guidelines late last year. The update seeks to support flexible, individualized pain management that improves patients' pain function and quality of life. The guidelines are not meant to be implemented as a one-size-fits-all policy, she said. Using dose limits in law would be a misapplication. That's a cold comfort to patients like Sandy Masagli, 41, of Manteca, who endures severe migraines, as well as neck and back pain from a spinal cord tumor and cavernous malformation. She said her Kaiser doctor told her in November that she must now have fewer prescriptions. I just white knuckle it, Sandy said. There was a time I started to drink alcohol sometimes, just looking for that relief to quiet my body down. Kaiser is pushing patients to go to the street, she said. We need help and aren't getting it. Even people who are able to get pain meds say they live in fear of having them cut off, and they must go through various contortions to keep them. Many medical guidelines on opioids suggest alternative therapies, but the catch is they're expensive. A lot of us would love to take advantage of other options for pain relief and symptom management, but they are not covered by insurance or aren't funded fully, citing acupuncture, physical therapy, and massage therapy as examples. In the past 5 years, she witnessed other people living with pain losing their access to medication. It's the criminalization of medically necessary treatment, she said.
This is from Yale School of Medicine, Endometriosis, Changing the Trajectory of a Painful Systemic Disease.
Even though endometriosis, a condition in which tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside the uterus, is among the most common gynecological conditions, it remains one of the most misunderstood and misdiagnosed. Time and again, as far back as the age of Hippocrates, physicians have failed to recognize endometriosis as a real disease with underlying physical causes and often blamed women for the debilitating symptoms they experienced. Yeah. The now discredited mystery disorder, presumed for centuries to be psychological in origin, was most likely endometriosis in a majority of cases. I'm sorry. That is like the OG. Don't worry about it, you're just on your period.
Yeah. She's just one of those,
That's her own fault.
Period
If she
habits.
would have been married by now. It's the woman's fault. They're like, bitch, no, it's not. You just can't see inside me. It's all in her head. It's all in her head. I have a lot of things that people keep just telling me are, in my head that just seem to, happened to not be in my fucking head.
Yeah.
So.
She's just one of those that have difficult periods.
The now discredited mystery disorder, presumed for centuries to be psychological in origin, was most likely endometriosis in a majority of cases, wrote Sienna Nezat, MD, and his,
Medical doctor. I don't know. You can say MD. I'm fine. I'm sorry.
and his colleagues in a 2012 article, Infertility and Sterility. Sounds weird. If so, then this would constitute one of the most colossal mass misdiagnoses in human history, one that over the centuries has subjected women to murder, madhouses, and lives of unremitting physical, social, and psychological pain. The number of lives that may have been affected by such centuries-long misdiagnosis is staggering to consider, likely involving figures in the multi-millions. While one might assume that the ancient perspective on endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain is a relic of the past, that's not necessarily true. Researchers estimate that over 10% of the women of childbearing age live with endometriosis. Over 190 million adults worldwide. While initially complaints often include painful periods and or infertility, in reality the disease has a vast number of other symptoms, many of which extend beyond the pelvis to other regions of the body. For some women, the pain correlates with their menstrual cycle. For others, symptoms are constant, and too many patients with endometriosis suffer severe debilitating symptoms that drastically reduce their quality of life. Unfortunately, the dismissive and demeaning attitudes of some physicians towards endometriosis is not just something that used to happen. It remains prevalent today. On average, it takes women 10 years to receive an accurate diagnosis of endometriosis, and many see at least 4 or 5 doctors before their pain is taken seriously. Now emerging research has demonstrated that endometriosis is a chronic, systemic disease with multi-manifestations affecting the entire body. At Yale School of Medicine, Hugh Taylor, MD, Anita O'Keefe, young professor of OB, gynecology, and reproductive sciences, and professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, and department chair. Ow.
It's a lot of titles.
It is. Bro, just say you went to school too long.
Just say you're an academic.
Just say you're a virgin.
You're a virgin.
And development biology and department chair specializes identifying the dozens of symptoms of endometriosis, explaining why these symptoms occur, and advocating for recognition of severe pain caused by the disease. Menstrual cramps are the only pain that we as human beings accept as normal, says Taylor. Yeah. Any other pain would prompt one to seek medical attention, but here we have pain that we've normalized. Thus, the pain of endometriosis is too often underappreciated and under-recognized by physicians, other healthcare providers, and even by patients and their families. Researchers currently think that most cases of endometriosis result from what they call retrograde menstruation. This condition occurs when cells from the uterus and other menstrual debris flow backward out of the fallopian tubes and settle in the abdomen, where they implant and grow. The pain of the disease may be caused by several different mechanisms. The cells may implant around nerves, irritating or compressing them. The endometrial cells may also produce inflammatory molecules that irritate and inflame the surrounding tissue. Over the long term, the inflammation can lead to scarring and adhesions, which create further pain. Endometriosis can eventually lead to the pulling and twisting of tissues, says Taylor. This distorted anatomy can also cause pain. Sometimes, physicians even find endometrial cells outside the abdominal cavity, lodging within the lungs or even in the brain, for example. Taylor's lab was the first to describe that some cases of endometriosis may also originate from stem cells. Usually, stem cells are mobilized to repair areas of inflammation or injury in the body. His group has found, however, that they also deliver certain molecules that prompt the growth of endometriosis lesions. The lesions of endometriosis may be perceived by the body like an injury. The stem cells are drawn there to repair the body, but in reality, they're helping to promote the endometriosis. New research is revealing that endometriosis is not just a gynecologic disease, but rather a widespread inflammatory disorder. Taylor's lab has found that the disorder communicates with the body in numerous ways. The disease, for example, secretes small RNA molecules called microRNAs that travel to organs beyond the pelvis where they can alter gene expression. Endometriosis can also activate macrophages and other immune cells that induce whole body inflammation. Based on these insights, Taylor's team is currently exploring new anti-inflammatory therapies, including repurposing drugs used for other inflammatory conditions. Studies on twins shows that genetic factors account for approximately 50% of a woman's risk of developing endometriosis, but the disease itself can be attributed to a single gene or two. There's certainly a familial tendency towards endometriosis, but it's not like breast cancer, where you can find a gene such as BRCA, which causes breast cancer in a large percentage of women living with it, and identify who is going to develop it, says Taylor. We believe endometriosis is polygenic with multiple genes that all have a net contribution. In future studies, Taylor hopes to better understand the multitude of genes that interact to cause endometriosis so that his team can identify targets for potential therapy. But we're not there yet, he says. Furthermore, studying the genetics of endometriosis may also help researchers better understand its association with comorbid conditions. For example, in 2023, JAMA Network Open Publication has identified gene aberrations in women with endometriosis that overlap with psychiatric conditions. In other words, genetic commonalities may partially explain why endometriosis patients also have higher incidences of depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. The epidemiological associations between endometriosis and these psychiatric traits were not only due to experiencing chronic pain, but also underlying biological and genetic mechanisms, says Dora Koller, PhD, a postdoctoral fellow at Yale School of Medicine and first author of the study. Endometriosis typically begins to manifest as extremely painful periods. This pain, however, may extend to the intervals between periods and occur in places outside the uterus. Symptoms may include pelvic pain, back pain, bladder pain, and frequent urination, painful bowel movements, and other gastrointestinal issues, and fatigue. But doctors often fail to consider endometriosis when women seek help for their specific range of symptoms. For instance, a urologist or a gastroenterologist may not immediately associate their patient's bladder or digestive symptoms with endometriosis. It's like the blind man with the elephant analogy, says Taylor. Everyone looks at their own aspect of the disease rather than the big picture. Endometriosis is also linked to depression and anxiety. Unfortunately, many doctors blame the pain women experience on these mental symptoms. However, when Taylor's laboratory team induced endometriosis in mice, the animals shortly developed depression and anxiety. How do you tell if a mouse is depressed or anxiety?
It won't
eat
as much.
It won't go through the
It won't
maze or whatever.
it won't play. It'll just mope around. Yeah, for a mouse, you can tell.
So let's see, out of all the shit that I have, I think I have depression and anxiety, and then I mope around and I get very anxious.
I think you're very cynical.
Very cynical.
And angry.
I'm angry on the inside. Depression and anxiety are directly caused by the disease, he emphasizes. In some women, the first sign of endometriosis is difficulty getting pregnant. They experience no pain, but infertility brings them to a doctor who ultimately diagnoses endometriosis as the reason they've been unable to conceive or carry a child. In other cases, women who had been previously dismissed when they go to the doctor with painful symptoms finally receive a diagnosis of endometriosis when they struggle with infertility down the road. Many times, women only get taken seriously when they are unable to get pregnant, says Koller. New research is now revealing that endometriosis causes more health challenges than initially thought. Studies show that having endometriosis is linked to a greater risk of heart disease later in life. Other research has found that the disease can cause changes in metabolism, including difficulty maintaining a healthy weight. Now that explains a lot. While these associations were already known, women themselves were once again often blamed rather than the disease. Shocker. How dare you get fat? Not, I'm full of scar tissue. Take it out. Physicians used to say that being thin was a risk factor for developing endometriosis, says Taylor. But his lab was first to prove by using mouse models that the disease caused mice to be thinner, not the other way around. Furthermore, doctors used to attribute heart disease to the hormonal medications that endometriosis patients take and the surgeries they often undergo. Once again, Taylor's lab disproved this assumption. We induce endometriosis in mice, and they developed heart disease, he says. Women wait years for diagnosis. Unfortunately, women spend years seeing doctor after doctor for their symptoms, and often, says Taylor, they're dismissed or initially misdiagnosed. This delay is due in part to the old clinical standards for diagnosis being laparoscopic surgery. Although that is still the definitive way to identify it, we can have a very good idea if someone has endometriosis just by her symptoms alone and state some easier treatments to alleviate the pain, says Taylor. But he also blames the delay on sexist attitudes that are still common among physicians. I often hear demeaning, horrible comments from doctors who believe that women with endometriosis are just anxious and complain too much or are overly sensitive to pain. This lack of early intervention has tragic consequences, especially because the disease often first strikes when women are in school or in the early stages of their career. The debilitating pain can change their life trajectory, says Taylor. At times, it keeps them from performing well or forces them to miss work or school. It holds them back, and you just don't get a do-over on your early education. I actually missed a lot of school when I was a kid because of my period. So yeah, I probably had it a long time ago. Just had no idea. You know why? Because we're all told to suck it up.
White knuckle it.
White knuckle it.
Pray the pain away.
Pray the pain away. Hell yeah. Hell yeah, bro.
Hell yeah, bro.
You say that while you down a whole bunch of fucking alcohol trying to numb your fucking pain.
Yeah, a bunch of alcohol and McDonald's.
Trust me, I would love to just like binge on alcohol and McDonald's, but drinking is less responsible than pain medication, and I'm a parent, and pain medication I can function and do things as I can go to work.
I could.
Well, I could, but you know, you're gonna see a lot more fuck up. Majority of available treatments for endometriosis today are hormonal therapies. The standard first-line treatment is a class of synthetic hormones called progesterones, typically in the form of birth control pills. This treatment, however, fails to relieve pain in a third of patients, while others will experience adverse effects including weight gain, mood changes, nausea, and irregular bleeding. In total, hormonal therapy is not optimal in about half of patients. When medications fail, women may also choose to undergo surgery. The only way to obtain a definitive diagnosis is through surgery, which is unheard of for such a common disease, says Collar. This procedure involves removing the endometrial lesions, and it can be very effective in reducing pain. Surgical excision, however, is not a cure. It does not prevent reoccurrence of the lesions, among other downsides. As in, I don't, before even reading it, I can tell you that one of the downsides is that every time that they open you up and do surgery, they cause more scar tissue, which causes more endometrial tissue to build up next to it. So it's like a wham, 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 wham every time.
Yep.
Yeah. This is life. The decision to perform surgery often means that one has waited until they feel bad enough that they want to undergo a surgical procedure, says Taylor. It's not a good option for early recognition and treatment of the disease. Another treatment is Lupron. The injection drug works by suppressing estrogen levels to zero and putting a patient on temporary menopause. Once administered, it doesn't take effect for several weeks. Lupron is an extreme therapy, says Taylor. Physicians typically offer their patients supplemental hormones to mitigate the side effects, including hot flashes and fatigue. But unlike taking a pill that can be discontinued immediately, if a patient decides the side effects aren't worth the benefits, she must wait months for the drug to wear off. Fucking A, man. Over the past few years, researchers have developed an alternative to Lupron called GnRH antagonists. These oral therapies target the same receptor and have numerous benefits. They start lowering estrogen levels in the body in as little as 24 hours, and the doses can be titrated. This allows doctors to prescribe smaller doses that avoid full-blown menopause. These have been a game changer because they are much gentler, kinder, and easier to use, just as effective as the old-fashioned medications, says Taylor, who was the leader of the clinical trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine that led to the approval of elagolix, or Orilissa, the first GnRH antagonist in the United States. These drugs have become the most commonly used second-line therapy when birth control pills fail. Taylor and his team are working hard in the lab to improve the diagnosis of endometriosis, including developing a diagnostic blood test that looks for molecular biomarkers of the disorder, such as microRNAs, as a way to prevent the need for surgery. Our goal is to recognize this disease early enough that we don't ever need to do surgeries to diagnose it, he says. And if we recognize it early enough, before the scarring and adhesions form, we may never need surgical therapy. Huh. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, it is kind of weird that there's something that is so common that the only way to confirm that it's there is literally just to, like, open
Cut
it
you
up
open.
and check it out.
Yeah.
Like, no imaging, no, like, it won't
It's
come up on
because
anything.
nobody's put in enough time and resources to check out this problem that women have been having forever.
Because it's all in our heads.
Yeah.
Actually, it's going to our heads. It's
It's-
just starting down here.
It's literally sexism, basically, that they haven't discovered more about this. That's not funny.
As researchers continue to learn more about the molecular biology and pathophysiology of endometriosis, Taylor also hopes to see more treatment options beyond hormonal medications. Because research shows that inflammation plays a significant role in the disease, his team is interested in repurposing drugs currently used for such inflammatory conditions as Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis to see whether they relieve the symptoms of endometriosis. Other key options include targeting the circulating microRNAs secreted by the disease by using specific microRNA inhibitors. Animal models are already showing promising results in both these areas of research. Exciting progress is already being made, but half the battle will be convincing the medical community and beyond to recognize endometriosis as the complex disease that it is. The more we understand and embrace that complexity, the sooner we're going to get to better therapies that treat the entire disease, says Taylor. That requires getting people to start taking women's pain seriously, being unafraid to talk about menstrual cramps, and treating endometriosis sooner before it gets to a stage where a woman needs surgery. So, you know, all those, like, online jokes and stuff like that of, like, guys throwing chocolate at their wives while they're on their periods and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe they have endometriosis and they are legitimately in a significant amount of pain that you can't even begin to fucking fathom, including mood swings, because being in pain causes your temper to flare and your blood pressure to go up and everything else. You know that as well as I do. This is from Bloomberg Law. Navajo uranium standoff risks legal clashes in nuclear West. Uranium shipments from a new Grand Canyon mine begin July 30th. 2 companies are planning mines near New Mexico tribal land. Why don't you guys just fuck off?
The Navajo Nation took the unusual step of using its police force to try to impede uranium shipments across its land last week. A preview of legal environmental battles to come if other uranium mines open up in the Southwest. Energy Fuels Resources Incorporated on July 30th began transporting its first shipments of uranium ore from its new Pinyon Plain mine near the Grand Canyon in Arizona to the company's White Mesa Mill in southeast Utah, the first of its possibly many such shipments to the only uranium ore processing site in the United States. Transporting uranium ore is banned on the Navajo Nation, but Navajo police were unable to stop the shipment.
As in Navajo Nation land.
Yeah. So you're not supposed to do it, but they did it anyway, and they couldn't stop them because
it's the Navajo police and nobody gives a fuck about them.
damn.
Nobody cares about.
Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs announced August 2nd that she negotiated a pause on the shipments across the Navajo Nation while tribal officials and Energy Fuels discussed a solution.
The solution is to fucking stop.
The clash between the Navajo Nation and uranium miners is happening as climate change is sparking new interest in nuclear energy, and high uranium prices have motivated mining companies to begin exploring for uranium around the edges of Navajo Nation in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The failure of the federal government to clean up hundreds of abandoned mines in the United States, most uranium-rich region, has undermined trust that it can be extracted without harming public health across the nuclear West, said Andrew Mergen, an environmental law professor at Harvard Law School. Uranium mining near indigenous land and transporting the ore through the Navajo Nation is likely to spark more conflict in a region where Native Americans have been traumatized by past mining, said Amber Raimondo, Energy Director for the Grand Canyon Trust, a regional environmental group. The Navajo Nation and other tribes have been clear that they don't want uranium anywhere near them anymore, Raimondo said. It doesn't really matter what people think is legal or is not legal. We'll see that tested in courts. Trucking uranium across indigenous land against the will of tribes touches at the heart of some difficult sovereignty issues, likely to intensify if uranium mining continues to ramp up, Mergen said. Those are really potentially difficult issues, not just legal issues, he said. Environmental groups worry about water pollution, and tribes say the mines continue a decades-long legacy of uranium production that has left their land polluted and citizens stricken with cancer. Motherfuckers. Mining and possible water pollution at Pinyon Plain near the Grand Canyon were part of the impetus for President Joe Biden to declare a new national monument surrounding the mine and Grand Canyon National Park in 2023, blocking any other new mine proposals on federal land in the region. Every time we see a new wave of uranium mining in the Southwest, we see a new wave of pollution, said Taylor McKinnon, Southwest Director for the Center for Biological Diversity and Environmental Group. The Navajo Nation accused Energy Fuels of breaking tribal law when it trucked about 50 tons of uranium ore through the reservation last week without the nation's approval. Navajo Nation President Nagren signed an order requiring Energy Fuels to strike an agreement with the tribal government before shipping more uranium ore across the region. We're a land of laws, Nagren said in a statement. As the executive branch, as the president of Navajo Nation, we're here to enforce these laws to make sure nobody is breaking these laws. Energy Fuels said it followed all legal requirements for safe transportation of Pinyon Plain's uranium ore, which will eventually be used as fuel for nuclear power plants. Energy Fuels CEO Mark Chalmers said in a statement August 2nd that the company looks forward to negotiations facilitated by Hobbs, even though the company has gone above and beyond any legal requirements. He said he looks forward to addressing any of Nygren's reasonable concerns. The Navajo Nation and Hobbs' office declined to comment on the Energy Fuel statement. Activist organizations are spreading unwarranted fear about risks associated with transporting uranium ore, Chalmers said.
Okay, so he should live like right next to the mine for the next 5 to 10 years to make sure that there is nothing to fear. To show people, look, I can drink the water that comes, from the same area. It's totally fine. Let's
eat the animals on the land.
Money where your mouth is, bro. Like literally.
Go get cancer, dude.
Please.
More than 30 million tons of uranium ore were mined during the Cold War from more than 500 places on the sprawling Navajo Nation that spans 3 states, one of the country's primary sources of uranium used for nuclear bombs and nuclear power plants until the 1980s. Cancer cases among Navajo miners were rampant at the time. Most of the mines have never been cleaned up, leaving a long-lasting legacy of radioactive waste, considered one of the region's most significant environmental justice challenges. The Environmental Protection Agency added uranium waste piles on the Navajo Nation in Arizona to the national priorities list this spring, paving the way for the federal government to help clean up sites left behind by companies that mined uranium there from the late 1940s to 1986. The future of uranium mining near the Navajo Nation is uncertain because analysts don't expect uranium prices to peak again after years of depression. Uranium prices peaked at around $106 after the U.S. and 19 other countries attended the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Dubai, pledged to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050 because nuclear power plants don't emit greenhouse gases and they can replace coal and natural gas generators that are driving climate change. Russia had long been a chief supplier of the uranium used for nuclear fuel, but in the wake of the war in Ukraine, President Biden this year signed into law a ban on uranium imports from Russia to revive domestic uranium enrichment and production. Uranium was $25 per pound 6 years ago. Today, uranium hovers around $82. Pinyon Plain will likely be the biggest or one of the biggest contributors to domestic uranium mining for the next few years. Curtis Moore, an Energy Fuel Senior Vice President, said in an email, "It's a great mine." But the Navajo Nation views uranium mining near its reservation as a desecration, especially in areas its people consider sacred outside the reservation, spokesman George Hardin said. 2 companies have recently announced plans to expand uranium exploration and mining in western New Mexico near Mount Taylor, a mountain sacred to the Navajo people. Premier American Uranium Incorporated announced on July 26th that it plans to expand uranium prospecting at its Cabaletta project near Mount Taylor in Cabala National Forest near the town of Grants, New Mexico. The company estimates more than 18 million pounds of uranium oxide could be mined there. Premium American didn't respond to recent requests for comment. The U.S. Forest Service said in an email on July 31st that it will soon complete an updated environmental review of Laramide Resources Limited, nearby's proposed La Jarra Mesa uranium mine, which may contain more than 7 million pounds of uranium oxide. An updated draft of that review is due in January, and a final decision is scheduled for 2026. Laramide, which is also planning to develop another uranium mine closer to the Navajo Nation near Crown Point, New Mexico, didn't respond to requests for a comment. Water pollution is among environmental groups' biggest concerns about uranium mining near Grants. The Grants area already has permanent groundwater pollution from past uranium mining, said McKinnon of the Center for Biological Diversity. They've had high rates of cancer, and more mining promises more pollution. The Navajo Nation wrote a letter to the Forest Service in 2012 saying it unequivocally opposes the La Jara Mesa project. Hardin said he can't comment about the nation's current position on the La Jara Mesa project, but said that uranium development around Mount Taylor amounts to desecrating a sacred place. To Navajos, one of the only words that comes to mind is appalling, Hardin said. Uranium, Navajos believe, should not be removed from the ground. It disturbs harmony.
This is a print interview from the New York Times. Thomas Piketty thinks America is primed for wealth redistribution.
In 2013, the French economist Thomas Piketty, in his bestseller Capital in the 21st Century, a book eagerly received in the wake of the 2008 economic collapse, put forth the notion that returns on capital historically outstrip economic growth. The upshot, the rich get richer while the rest of us stay stuck in the mud. Now, nearly a decade later, Piketty is set to publish A Brief History of Equality, in which he argues that we're on a trajectory of greater, not less, equality, and lays out his prescriptions for remedying our current corrosive wealth disparities, in short, tax the rich.
In the time since Capital in the 21st Century was published, there's been a huge proliferation in the number of American billionaires. Something like 130 new ones were added between 2020 and 2021 alone. That happened in the context of growing public discussion and anger about economic inequality. But what the hell happened? What enabled the ultra-wealthy to flourish in the face of such widespread antipathy?
Let me put this very clearly. I understand that each year and each decade is tremendously important, but it's also important not to forget about the general evolution. We have become much more equal societies in terms of political equality, economic equality, social equality as compared with 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The movement, which began with the French and US revolutions, I think is going to continue. Of course, there are structural factors that make it difficult. The system of political finance, the structure of media finance, the basic democratic institutions are less democratic than they should be. This makes things complicated, but it's always been complicated. The Supreme Court for decades made it possible to create a progressive income tax. They were fine with the racial segregation, but having a progressive income tax was unconstitutional. In the end, it took 20 years to change the Constitution, but then it happened and contributed to reduced inequality.
Okay, so you're saying that the long-term trend is toward more equality. But in 1990, there were 66 US billionaires. Now there are more than 700. Over the last 40 years or so, chief executive pay is up more than 900%, even accounting for inflation. The average worker's pay over the same period up only 12%. You believe we should be thinking of those factors as road bumps on the path to greater economic equality?
If you take the big picture, yes, but the other lesson from the big picture from history is that it takes major political mobilization to keep moving in the direction of equality. In the United States today, the democratic institutions, the rules of the game are set up in a manner that indeed the rich are entrenched. But if you look at opinion polls about a billionaire tax in the U.S., among Democratic and also Republican voters, you have a huge approval. So is this the political system able to respond to this, or is it rigged? The lesson from history is that when the political system is rigged, at some point you have a reaction, you have a mobilization.
What did you think of the billionaire tax that Biden just proposed?
It would have been better before his election if you had told the American public before the elections that he wanted a wealth tax, which again is something that is very high in opinion polls. This would have been much easier. This could have forced the Democratic Congress to take a stand. It's more complicated now, but if it works, it's better than nothing.
I understand what you're saying about the popularity of a proposed billionaire tax, but do you believe America is at a place where a phrase like wealth redistribution, which is what you're talking about, is broadly politically plausible?
When you say Americans don't like redistribution, some certainly don't like it. But in the 20th century, high progressive taxation of income and inherited wealth was to a large extent invented by the United States. That's why it always makes me skeptical when people say Americans don't like this, don't like that. Look at history. There's no deterministic reason why a given country should be like this or that. Sometimes in my country and in the US also people tell you, look, we are not Swedes. This is used as an argument to say that there is a culture of equality in Sweden, which we would never have.
But Swedes themselves weren't always Swedes.
Exactly. Sweden until 1910, 1920 was one of the most unequal countries in the world. with a special sophistication in the way inequality was organized. You could have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on the size of your wealth. Even corporations had the right to vote in municipal elections in Sweden until 1910. Sweden was like this, but then moved to something else.
This is only a half joking question. Let's say in the United States, the billionaires get sick of being the bad guys and don't want to be taxed the way Biden is proposing. So they move to Ireland or some other tax haven. Then what happens?
But that's the point. These people don't live in they rely on the rest of the world, which means that we have to impose rules on the conditions in which they can enjoy these assets, which were produced by the collective. All wealth is collective by nature in the sense that it relies on the work of hundreds, thousands, millions of engineers, technicians, and the accumulation of knowledge. Then private property is a social construction that we invent in order to organize economic and social relations. It's a very useful social invention as long as you keep under control how much you can accumulate, how much power you can accumulate, etc. But none of these assets are their assets. They are a product of a collective process. No one invented anything by himself or herself.
That kind of ontological argument might be a hard sell for some Americans.
For some, but this has nothing to do with the American spirit, American values. It has something to do with the small subset of people who are just pushing their interest. If you ask the American public about who is working hard, is it the normal people or the elite whose effort created everything, you will be surprised by the answer.
My sense is that in the very recent past, a lot of the growth in wealth has resulted from entrepreneurship rather than the accumulation of inherited wealth. That's in conjunction with skyrocketing rates of return for the wealthy. Do those factors have any implications for how we understand the accumulation of capital generally?
If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, you also had lots of new innovation and new wealth. We invented the automobile, electricity, transatlantic radio. People in every time period tend to say today is different. This is big innovation, new wealth. But in a changing economy where we make technological discoveries, you always have this process. But the thing is, if it's not regulated, if we don't design institutions in order to spread the wealth, on the contrary, we have an institutional setup where you can accumulate wealth by using public infrastructure, public education, the health system, and then once you have accumulated the wealth, you push a button and you transfer it somewhere else. Remember the ProPublica study before the summer of 2021, where they looked at billionaires in the US? They pay almost zero federal income tax as compared with their wealth. If you pay no tax, it's easier to accumulate more wealth, and that's what continues.
An economic argument in favor of billionaires is that their doing well is a sign that our system of capitalism is working, and that it means growth for everyone. But growth has been slowly down at the exact same time that billionaires have been rolling in it. Has that given definitive lie to the idea that the success of the 0.1% is a good idea for the rest of us too?
It's proof as far as proof can get in social and political sciences. The evidence that we have is that if you take the United States, the growth rate of national income per capita has been divided by two following the Reagan decade. It's been a little more than 1 to 1.2% per year of the national income growth per capita, real growth rate between 1990 and 2020. It used to be more than 2.5% between 1950 and 1980. The tax performance in the Reagan decade was supposed to boost growth. Maybe you would have more inequality, but the size of the pie is going to grow much faster than before than the average wages and income of average Americans will grow like you've never seen. That is not what we've seen. The big lesson from this is that the period of maximum prosperity of the U.S. economy in the middle of the century was a period where you had the top income tax rate of 90%, 80%, and this was not a problem because income gaps of 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 are not necessary for growth. The other big conclusion is that what really matters for economic prosperity is education and relative equality in education. The key reason the U.S. economy was so productive historically in the middle of the 20th century was because of the huge educational advance over Europe. In the 1950s, you have 90% of the young generation going to high school in the U.S. At the same time, it's 20 to 30% in Germany, France, Britain, and Japan. The story that Reagan tried to tell the country in the 1980s, which is basically forget about equality, the key to prosperity is to let the top become richer and richer. It doesn't work.
Have you seen any structural or ideological changes that you think make our moment different from historically comparable ones?
Well, the dominant ideology has been moving toward the view that we've gone too far in terms of market liberalization, in terms of globalization without regulation, and the super rich getting richer. The problem is that we're still stuck with institutions that were set up in the 80s and 90s in terms of limited tax progressivity, free capital flows without any common collective regulation, and without financial cadastry, so that you can track who owns what and where, which is a big problem when you want to impose sanctions on oligarchs. In the United States, this institutional setup has been reinforced because of Trump's big tax cuts on corporations. There are many dramas we associated with Trump, but part of the drama is that he has been able to tell the middle class and lower middle class, look, we're going to continue with tax dumping, but we're going to protect you in other way by protecting you against Chinese and Mexicans and the Muslims. He was able to be elected on an ideology where you don't redistribute between the rich and the poor, but rather you protect Americans, especially white male Americans, against anybody who is foreign. The risk is that neoliberalism is replaced by this form of neo-nationalism in order to avoid redistribution. Sometimes people like Trump can be successful with this strategy because it's much more clear message than saying, let's look at the history of progressive taxation.
You mentioned the oligarchs. In America, we don't like to think that we have them. That's for a country like Russia. Instead, we like to think we have entrepreneurs who achieved through merit. But the similarities are obvious. They're all taking advantage of the free global movement of capital and have a disproportionate amount of political influence. Do you see America as being as securely in the grip of the oligarch class as other countries we think of being less democratic?
The US oligarchs have less control of the political system than the Putin clique in Russia, that's for sure. In terms of what we fraction of wealth accumulation is due to individual effort, individual merit, as opposed to legal and institutional system that is working for them more than the rest of the country. It's difficult to say. Many Russian oligarchs bought the right assets at the right time, resold it. This is business life. To me, maybe the best comparison between the US is not so much with Russia today, but with Europe and the Belle-Esque before 1914, a system which is nominally democratic, but where the concentration of wealth is so high and lacking proper rules about political finance, political influence, and the democratic system is not able to have a common sense reaction to this excessive level of inequality that in the long run is not good for US prosperity. Particularly because when other countries get more educated than the US, then its economic leadership will be gone forever. US economic leadership came from mass education, not from a small elite of billionaires. They have never been the source of US prosperity, and they never will be.
You know, I do find it hard to wrap my head around the idea that after 40 years of worsening inequality, you, the inequality guy, are publishing a book saying we're on the right track historically. It's sort of cold comfort to know we're more equal today than we were 100 or 200 years ago. Really give me a reason to feel as optimistic as you do.
Give me a reason to be optimistic. By looking at my historical evidence, by thinking about the big picture, I've become more optimistic. I was a bit puzzled that many people looking at capital in the 21st century came away with a pessimistic conclusion. I'm trying to show that the key in history is not the big catastrophes, but the positive political construction of an alternative. And this process started with the French Revolution and the US Revolution. This process toward more equality is more deeply rooted in our modern ethos and modern political cultures than most people believe. I remember in 2014 having a public discussion with Elizabeth Warren in Boston. I was talking about a progressive wealth tax with a rate of 5% per year or 10% per year for billionaires. She looked at me like, wow, that's way too much. Joe Biden today, a centrist Democrat who voted for the tax reform of 1986, is coming with a wealth tax. Things can change pretty fast. This article is from 2022, by the way.
No.